Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where right now the president is holding an event in the Oval Office as the White House is ramping up its pursuit of President Trump's political rivals, as the president calls for new criminal investigations and prosecutions, asserting himself as the nation's chief law enforcement officer, shattering post-Watergate norms of Justice Department independence. Two sources tell NBC News that a federal grand jury is meeting today in Maryland, where prosecutors will present evidence against former Trump National Security Advisor turned Trump critic John Bolton. Federal officials telling NBC News last week Bolton was expected to be charged with federal crimes after the FBI searched his home and office back in August as part of a national security investigation in search of classified records. Today's developments coming 1 week after a federal grand jury indicted New York Attorney General Letitia James on bank fraud charges. James, of course, a frequent target of the president's due to her office's investigations into his business. And it comes 3 weeks after another Trump critic, former FBI Director James Comey, was indicted for allegedly lying to Congress during testimony several years ago. Both Comey and James deny the allegations against them. In the Oval Office yesterday, the president, flanked by his attorney general and FBI director, claimed he was not weaponizing the Justice Department, even as he called for a criminal investigation into, among others, federal officials who investigated him during his prior administration.
What they did was criminal. Deranged Jack Smith, in my opinion, is a criminal. And I noticed his interviewer was, I think that was Weissman. And I hope they're going to look into Weissman, too. Weissman's a bad guy. And he had somebody in Lisa, who was his puppet, worked in the office really as the top person. And I think that she should be looked at very strongly. They have committed massive political crime. I hope they're looking at Shifty Schiff. I hope they're looking at all these people. And I'm allowed to find out. I'm allowed to, I'm, in theory, the chief law enforcement officer.
The Wall Street Journal, meanwhile, is now reporting that the Trump administration plans to overhaul the IRS to enable the agency to pursue criminal inquiries into left-leaning groups. According to the Journal, a senior IRS official has already drawn up a list of potential targets, which include major Democratic donors. NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez joins me now, along with NBC News senior justice reporter Reilly and former U.S. Attorney Carol Lam. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. Gabe, let me start with you. President Trump expanding his list of enemies there in the Oval Office. What do you know, what are you hearing about whether the Justice Department is actively engaging with the president on those demands?
Well, Kristen, look, it is quite unprecedented. The president has been not just naming names of some of the more high-profile enemies he has on that list, but you just heard him in the soundbite you just played. He talks about Lisa Monaco, not just talking about potentially going after her criminally, potentially, but also just getting involved in her personal life, in her career. She's now works for Microsoft. The president urging that private company to go ahead and terminate her. So this is something really unprecedented, Kristen. However, the White House is not backing down. They have, when they're asked about this, they don't view this as retribution. They call it accountability. And they say that the DOJ was weaponized against then candidate Trump and also during his first term. And so now they view this as simply following the law. That's what they repeatedly say when you talk with White House officials, when you've heard the vice president asked about this. But it is quite interesting when you hear the president shifting rhetoric on this. Previously, he has said, well, he hasn't told the Justice Department to do anything. He's just raising questions. But as you've reported, Kristen, according to a Trump administration official, just several weeks ago, the president had planned to send a private message to his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, with regards to some of his political enemies. Turned out it wasn't a private message. It went out on his social media platform, and that essentially was directly asking her to get involved and target his political enemies. So certainly shifting messaging there, but the White House continues to insist, not retribution, it is accountability in their view.
Yeah, and the question is, could that public post undercut any legal action against the people who have now been indicted, who were a part of that post, James Comey, Letitia James? So there's been a lot of reaction to President Trump's comments in the Oval Office on Wednesday. The fact, Gabe, that he was flanked by his attorney general, by the FBI director, the optics of it really extraordinary. And the question, does it look like a direct demand to his top law enforcement officials? What type of reaction are you hearing from both sides of the aisle, Gabe?
Look, at this point, Democrats predictably are outraged about this. They view this as, just an inappropriate, to say the least, use of presidential power to get involved in directly targeting his political adversaries. Republicans, for the most part, privately, they might, shake their heads at it, but publicly, they are not in any position, and they really have not pushed back against the president here. They are trying to keep on with the messaging that this is, the president using his power and to go after people that broke the law, and not wanting to continue this idea that it is weaponization, but rather this idea of accountability. So there are many Republicans that I've spoken with have basically shrugged this off and have not gotten in the way of what the president is doing at all, Kristen.
All right. Gabe Gutierrez continuing to track all of the developments out of the White House. Gabe, thank you so much. Ryan, Reilly, let me turn to you. Of course, we're all watching and waiting to see if the former national security advisor during the first Trump administration, John Bolton, someone who also served in the Bush administration, will be indicted. What are you hearing? What is the latest there?
Yeah, we could hear news of that any moment, because our understanding from our producer on the ground there is that in Greenbelt, Maryland, is that the grand jury has wrapped up, and most of the grand jurors have left from the day. How this typically works is the foreman of the grand jury would be in court for a return of that indictment. Sometimes you'll only have the initials read aloud in court, although when Trump was indicted, they didn't even do initials on that, although everyone knew what case they, of course, were referring to when that happened in D.C. But what we're looking for is essentially if the grand jury found probable cause, which is, of course, a lower standard, of the cases that have sort of gone against one of the people targeted by Donald Trump. This one, I think, experts would say has the least obvious signs of just outward political cases being brought forward, because this has some elements of it that were developed previously, whereas the James Comey and Letitia James cases seemed more about finding crimes to bring about those individuals. It was more targeting of those individuals rather than looking at underlying facts. There are some underlying facts that were spelled out in that in that search warrant affidavit that are being explored about the use of improper use of classified information. And this is a case that has precedent, obviously, both with the Trump case and with how the government has seriously considered the handling of classified documents, whereas the Letitia James case, is about a more James Comey case don't have those same bones to them and don't have the tradition of being brought forward on a regular basis by the Justice Department. So I think this one sort of stands out from those other two when you sort of talk about all of the cases that we've seen against sort of Trump's political enemies, Kristen.
And of course, John Bolton himself denying any wrongdoing. What have we actually heard from his attorney, Ryan?
Yeah, he denies wrongdoing in this case, and they do say that this is about politics, right? So I think that is because John Bolton was a really strong critic of Donald Trump, that he thinks that that's why he is being targeted here. This case, from the reporting that we know, sort of did have some initial start during the Biden administration, or at least the underlying facts happened during the Biden administration, but it was not something pushed forward. So this wasn't a case that started basically after Donald Trump took office or was directed by someone he personally appointed. But it's easy to get confused in these moments because we've seen those breakdown in barriers between the White House and the Justice Department, and obviously that highly unusual press conference that we saw at the White House yesterday, and directing, as we saw at the top of the hour, those comments directly about the people that he wants to target. So it just becomes a much trickier thing to sort of sort out. And this, will ultimately have to, if the grand jury does return a true bill, will ultimately be decided by another jury whether that they were able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher standard than the grand jury faces, that John Bolton did anything wrong, Kristen.
So, and Ryan, you take me to my next question, because as you have pointed out, as Gabe has pointed out as well, of course, two of President Trump's political enemies have already been indicted. What are you hearing about any potential future indictments?
Yeah, so I mean, the big one that he mentioned there was Adam Schiff, Senator Adam Schiff, who I think is obviously a big target for Donald Trump because he's been an albatross for Trump for a long time, starting with the first impeachment that we saw. So that is someone he obviously wants targeted. The reporting on that has been that that is a much trickier case. Even when you're talking about these really lower level cases that seemed aimed at a political target, even based on the facts that we know them about Adam Schiff's mortgages, because he has the two properties both at home in California and closer to D.C. That is going to be a trickier case just based on the public facts to bring forward. So we don't know if that one is just going to stall out. But, I think even people who were making sort of the worst predictions about the Justice Department before Donald Trump came back in office, I think are still sort of shocked by how quickly a lot of these lines and traditions have fallen to the wayside, and how he has been able to turn the Justice Department against his political enemies in this fashion that we've never really seen before in American history, Kristen.
All right, Ryan Reilly, thank you so much. You set us up very nicely for Carol Lam. Carol, thanks so much for joining us. So let's start with the broad question that Ryan has really mapped out well, which is that we have seen these public demands against his political enemies. And the question is, legally speaking, what, if any, implications could they have? Could they actually undercut the trials against a James Comey or a Letitia James?
They certainly could, Kristen. And because we've never seen this kind of vehement statement from the president that these people are guilty and should be prosecuted, it's going to be very difficult to see how judges are going to handle this, because in the first instance, they should issue a gag order, and the judges should say no more discussion from the president or anybody else on either side of the aisle. Either the prosecution or the defense should be talking about this case, and that's very common. But when you have the president of the United States not only calling for retribution but also calling for prosecutions in this manner, I think it is now it's going to become more normal for these vindictive prosecution motions to be made by the defense attorneys, because it's just so clear. I mean, it's never been put out there before in quite as clear a fashion, but it's both clear and unusual. And so it's the first time we're really going to see this kind of fact situation up in front of the criminal courts.
And Carol, obviously there are some key differences between what may become a case against John Bolton and the accusations against James Comey and Letitia James. What are you going to be watching for if, in fact, Ambassador Bolton is indicted?
The first thing we should watch for is what happens with the vindictive prosecution motion, selective prosecution motions that are brought by Jim Comey and Letitia James, and we expect both of them to raise these motions. And because they were indicted earlier and because they were in the so-called rocket docket of a court that moves very quickly, which is the Eastern District of Virginia, I think we will probably get a ruling on their motions before we get a ruling from the judge if John Bolton is indicted. And that will sort of give us a bit of a roadmap as to what the courts are going to be, how the reasoning is going to go in those cases. Now, of course, in the case of Letitia James and Jim Comey, we had the president's social media message, which may not have been intended to be public, but it was public, where he is, in fact, directly instructing Pam Bondi to bring these charges against Letitia James and Jim Comey. So when he gets up and he says, I could tell them to do this, but I'm not telling them to do this, I'm just hoping they will, that's belied by the fact that he actually has instructed her to bring these prosecutions. So that's what we should be looking for, is sort of how the courts, how comfortable the courts feel in saying that the President of the United States has so prejudiced these investigations, and it's so clear that they are vindictive in nature. Are the courts comfortable saying that? And I think we need to see that in all three of these cases.
And can you give us a sense? The president in the Oval Office on Wednesday said he is the chief law enforcement officer, of course, making these statements as he's flanked by his attorney general, his FBI director. What do you make of him declaring himself the chief law enforcement officer?
Yeah, it is so weird, Kristen. I'm sure every former prosecutor or current prosecutor who is watching this is just holding their heads and cringing because the norm is for the president to say, I am not communicating at all with the Justice Department about any particular prosecution that's off limits. I don't do it. And when you really think about it, that is absolutely necessary in a civil society, in one in which we use the criminal laws only to prosecute people who, based on the evidence, in the view of very experienced prosecutors and officials at the Department of Justice, are being prosecuted. And that has been the norm for so many decades. And to the extent that that appears to have been breached, it has been shut down quickly and effectively. But now all those barriers are gone. And it is so weird. There's no other term I can even conjure up to describe this. It is so weird to those of us who have spent decades prosecuting criminal offenses that, I mean, it's not just unprecedented, it's just wrong. It is. It's just wrong. And it appears that what today is the president saying he hopes there will be a prosecution, very clearly that's going to give way to his saying that there must be a prosecution brought, in this case, against a Democrat. It's just wrong.
Right. Carol Lam, thank you so much for your perspective, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.